So there I was, I'd lost at the Privy Council, and I got a cab to the airport, climbed on board Singapore Airlines first class, and I'd flown first class because I was certain that I'd win. It's the optimism in me. And I had these photographs which I began talking to the man next to me about my journey. He had been telling me about going to university to learn about succession, passing on wealth. When he asked what I did, I just explained that I'd walked out of the Privy Council just a matter of hours earlier. And he asked what the case was about, and I had photographs of Matakana Island, and I also had photographs of my family and our home at 1517 Granville Road. And I began to cry, and he put his hand over to me, and he said, "Can you imagine if you were flying back to New Zealand for a different reason? Could you imagine if you were flying back because a member of your family had died? Wouldn't you be sitting here right now praying to God to take away every asset that you own in exchange for having that life of the loved one back?" And it worked. I got off the plane in New Zealand and I had a smile on my face that my family were okay. And they were all crying. But I think they needed that hope. They needed to see that I was optimistic. I guess they knew how much work I'd put into it, how passionate I was. And this was a major loss because we were losing everything. We put everything into it. And so the judgment turned up in December. That was in October. And it was written by Justice John Henry, a New Zealand judge. And similar to the Court of Appeal majority, the judgment was wrong. It had wrong facts. It was a completely misleading document. And there weren't any comments by any of the other judges. Lord Lloyd, Lord Hophouse, Sir Andrew Leggett, and Lord Steyn. There was no commentary from them. For 18 years, I've toiled with what they did. And a few years ago, I came to realise that in the early days of the dominions, the different Commonwealth countries under the Empire, their final Court of Appeal was, of course, the Privy Council. And they were passing decisions, the English law lords were passing decisions that for example, the Australians would turn around and say, "What the hell did you do that for? Don't you understand what's going on down here? These are local issues. These are important to people down here, and here you are in England passing a decision that's totally irrelevant to the goings on down here. We might as well cut you off and set up our own ultimate Court of Appeal." And Canada was having the same problems. So to counter that, what the British law lords did was they invited judges from our different countries to go and sit and advise them on what were the local issues. And in this particular case, Justice Henry had told them that if I won against the bank, then the Maoris would lose the land. And so the decision was a political decision. Now, the land had been sold for cash in the 1870s, the 1880s, and there was never a mention or a complaint about it. Initially, they sold the entire 15,000 acres. In the late 1880s, they asked the government whether or not they'd buy back the 5,000 acre farmland part from a chap by the name of Whitaker and Russell. And so the government did, even though the Maoris had been compensated fully, they had sold the land. They asked for it to be given back to them. And so the government did that, gave them the land, and of course it never went to the tribe, it went to the chiefs. But the 10,000 acre coastal strip was owned by a chap by the name of William Daldy. In the 1930s, a pine plantation was planted by an Australian owner, and then it went through various ownerships until finally it was in receivership, and that's when I came along. And after my caveats were lifted and the bank was allowed to sell out to the Maoris, they were celebrating. People of Ngaitarangi were ecstatic that they'd got their hands on the land, and I could understand that. But when I won the hearing against the bank, they were they were obviously upset. The wider community upset. The ones who knew that my win meant that they could lose the land, but they were optimistic in writing and correspondence, etc. The lawyers had identified that if the Maoris had got the land from the bank that had stolen it from me, that they would get Crown support. And of course they did, in the appellate level. And so when they appealed that decision to the Court of Appeal in Wellington, and I lost and they won, they were celebrating again. The chap who put in the Waitangi claim was a really lovely guy by the name of Sonny Tawhia. Sonny was on a number of committees. He was very enthusiastic about job opportunities for young Māori. And he once asked me what I thought about a taipuri claim around the land, around the island, which is basically a fishing reserve, to stop people coming in and harvesting. And I supported that. I grew up in Rotorua, and I loved all the Māori culture, all the things that I learned at school, and so it wasn't sort of about us and them, although some people made it that. You must forgive me for my pausing in this. I just got a call from my sister Rosina that my mum's died, and as I said on the first video, I couldn't be there with her, and but Catherine and Sarah, two of my girls, they were there, holding her hand and rubbing her head, and she recognised them. They just flew in last night, and she puckered her lips for a kiss and a hug, and they patted her hair and put some water in her mouth, gave her lots of love and put on some music. She always loved piano. She was a beautiful pianist. And then Catherine put on some Scottish music, a Scottish piper, and played that. I said in the first tape that I needed to explain why I'm not there in New Zealand, and I think it necessary for me to to come back to the camera and explain. Sonny Tafia phoned me after they had won the Court of Appeal. And Sonny wasn't involved in the litigation, it was the Maori leadership involved. And they were telling all the people that that it was all secret and they couldn't really talk about it. And so when Sonny phoned me, he said that they had won and he wanted to know what exactly they had won. And I asked him some questions about what he thought, what was the understanding of the wider community as far as the win goes. And all the information he had was wrong. Just one second. So I packaged him up some information, pile, and put it in an envelope and sent it to him. And he challenged the Maori leadership over corruption and simply for not telling the wider community the truth of what was going on. And even at that stage, we didn't know the full extent of it. But the Privy Council case was in, I think, September of 1999, and on July the 8th of 99, Sonny Tafia's body was found in the back seat of a burnt-out car on Matakana Island. I got a copy of the police report after I'd come here to Australia. It took a bit to get hold of it, but it was a big thick file, and I started reading it about 10 o'clock at night, and there I was, just crying my eyes out. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I mean, I'd seen plenty of corruption and wrongdoing at that stage, but I didn't expect it to, to go as far as covering up a murder. Anybody watching this tape, you get hold of a copy of the police file if you've got access to it. And you'll see that there are 3 witnesses in there, people who were on committees with Sonny. And he was afraid, he was terrified. They said that he had got hold of documents that he wasn't supposed to have, and that Don Shaw had threatened to kill him. Don Shaw was ex-Special Forces and the head of customs there in Tauranga, where all sorts of skullduggery was going on with arms containers and drug containers getting redirected, so they would be shipped out of New Zealand as if it had kiwi fruit or timber in it. And but these 3 witness statements, each of them had stated that Sonny was fearful for his life. And so the police turned around in their report and they said that he drove into the forest and he He took a can of petrol out of his boot, went to his right rear wheel, took his top off, took his boots off, and poured petrol over them and set them on fire. And so forensics found the remains of the boot, his top, and a lighter at the right rear wheel. And then the report says that he poured petrol under the boot, up the left-hand side of the car, the entire interior, and then put the can back in the boot, closed the boot, got into the rear left seat and set himself on fire. And he left behind 2 young boys at his father's house. He lived there. He had no money issues. Toxicology showed that there were no drugs or alcohol in his system. There was sufficient lung tissue left to be able to show that he was actually conscious when the fire engulfed him. One of the islanders, Gary Lett, who owns some land right next to the sawmill, he told me that Don Shaw was on the road about an hour after the fire, and that he'd claimed that his car had broken down, and that he was nervous and sweaty and all the rest. And where his house was actually over in Rangawai Island, just a short distance away. Property that he didn't buy, that he somehow moved into, again through corruption. He wasn't Ngaitarangi, yet when I was asked by the 2 mayors to engage because of the Resource Management Act, if I were to own Matakana Island, I had to form a relationship. That was a compliance rule under the Resource Management Act. And so the negotiating point that I had for Maori was, of course, Don Shaw. And whenever I would have problems with him, and I tried to speak to Howard Palmer, the chairman of Ngaitarangi, or Inukanātai, the chairman of Taonga Moana Iwi Trust Board, or John Neal, the chairman of Matakana Island Trust, any of them, they all referred me back to having to deal with either Don Shaw or Graham Ingham. Now both of those guys, Ingham and Shaw, they own 25% of Tiko Tukutuku, the Maori company. And of course everything that was published in the newspapers seemed to be this line that the traditional landowners were getting Matakana Island back. It was when my caveats were lifted and the deal was allowed to go through. And they'd only got that deal because they put in a road blockade. They threatened to burn the forests. And they got the Maori Congress, Sir Graham Latimer and a group of that lot to go and hassle ITT Rainair and Earnslaw and make threats against their various investments all over New Zealand that there would be Maori problems unless they handed over the land to the Maori. All the complaints I've made regarding Sonny Tafia's death, again, they're all on record. Police Complaints Authority, etc. Anybody doing any research on this can take a look. You'll see that even they're crooked. They were lying with information that even they were giving me. The police were lying to me when I was asking them information. We had a number of threats. But I wasn't backing down to them. I armed myself. I organised a couple of levels of security so that my family would be protected, because they were threatening to kill me and to wipe out my bloodline. And anyway, by 2007, the shareholders of Tiko Tukutuku sold out to property developers. And the shareholders of Tiko Tukutuku turned out to be the hierarchy of Ngaitarangi, the same people that had told the government that the land was sacred and that it was covered in burial sites. And that's why the Crown were on their side, supported by the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Lands, the Crown Law Office. And of course, they were obligated to support Maori because of the fiduciary partnership through the Treaty of Waitangi. And that's one of the areas that I'm petitioning the Privy Council on. I'm saying to the Privy Council, in essence, that I sued the bank for breach of fiduciary duty, and if found guilty, I would get a constructive trust ownership over the Matakana Island land assets. And that I won the trial, and then at the appellate level, the judgments were false. Wrong law, wrong facts. And that as far as the fiduciary relationship goes between myself and the judges, us the public don't confer power to them to be crooks. We confer power to them to be impartial, to be accurate, to be diligent, and to do their job properly. And I didn't get that. One of the things that I've figured out about justice is that it's been completely hijacked by the legal industry. And every year more and more of the GDP goes towards them. All the legislation that gets written up. It basically means that everybody has to see a lawyer. Over the years I've travelled a lot. I grew up with the Vietnam War. And as a child I believed that we were the good guys and the Viet Cong were the bad. And of course I also believed at a young age that we weren't bombing Cambodia and Laos. And yet all that information that we were getting were just complete lies. Daniel Ellsberg put out the Pentagon Papers. He started actually at the Pentagon working at a very high level, and he started there on the day that the Americans claimed in the media that they were attacked by the North Vietnamese. And so he went through years and years of what he was reading in the paper compared to what he was seeing going on at an operational level was completely different, that the government were lying to the people. And this sort of comes back to the same thing of what I'm dealing with the Privy Council judges. That what they're putting out is they're putting out fake information. And of course they did that because of their obligation to protect Maori, but if their obligation is to protect Maori, then why did they deliver the ownership of Matakana Island into the hierarchy of the tribe in their own personal names? Now some people can say that that's not for the Crown to consider, that it's not their job to go and make those types of checks, but Isn't that what a fiduciary obligation's about? Just cross your T's and dot your I's. In 2002, I was so frustrated over the corruption and the knocking on doors that refused to answer that I pitched my tent on the local MP's front lawn, Stevie Chadwick. And I said, I'm on a hunger strike until I get something done. I want an inquiry into this. And so the Prime Minister, Helen Clark, got Russell Fairbrother to come to Rotorua. Russell's a barrister, member of Parliament for the Hawke's Bay. And he said that he had read the judgments, that he knew that the judgments were completely false. He knew the cliquey bunch of judges I was up against, that it was corruption, and that he was the deputy chairman of the Justice Select Committee, and that there would be an inquiry that I would win. And it was an optimistic indication that he was going to tackle the corruption in this particular case. And I was curious to know what exactly a win would mean, and he said he doubted that it would involve the land, and I thought that was unusual because if I'm right, then the defendants have no right to those assets. He said that it's Maori, it's political, but that I would get the amount of money that I'd spent on the litigation, which was around $5.5 million, I'd get that back. And I'd had quite a bit of experience with Justice Select Committees, or Select Committees overall, and I wanted to know what the terms of reference would be. So he said that he'd be back in 4 weeks with the details of the petition to Parliament. And so I went to Auckland, and I had lunch in Parnell with 2 lawyers who worked on my case, Rodney Newman and Bob Stevens, who worked for the government. And I was obviously enthusiastic. But when I told them that Russell Fairbrother was going to go after the corruption, and I repeated what he had said, Bob became immediately very angry, and he said he should shut his fucking mouth, because if he goes saying things like that, they'll kill his kids. And Russell turned up to my house 2 weeks later. He was nervous. He was a few hours late for the meeting, and there was something wrong. Something had really spooked him. What Bob Stevens had said, I put it in writing because I thought it was such a frightening statement. And I'd already had a number of other statements made to me by lawyers in private, and that then came true. And so I wanted to record it, put it in writing. And so I sent copies to various people, including Stevie Chadwick, our local MP. And but then a few months later there was a explosion in Russell Fairbrother's daughter's house, and his 2 granddaughters were killed. Again, somebody can go and get hold of the police report into that and take a look. But the report was inconclusive as to what caused the explosion. It sort of indicated a gas heater was in the property, But what I thought was unusual was that from the time that Russell came to see me and I had conveyed the information about him going after the corruption, his political career was basically over. Dr. David Cullen, the Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Cullen, was after him in Parliament. And it was unusual because they were from the same political party and he was ostracised. You know, some people can say that, you know, conspiracy theory, Chris, I'm just conveying the facts and all of them are verifiable. I realised by 2004 I had to get out of New Zealand. I had a variety of threats. I heard that the mongrel mob were after me, so being me, I went around and knocked on the door of Hoppy Roberts, the president of the mongrel mob. He was surprised to see me standing at his door. And I said, I think we need to talk about what's going on with Matakana Island. And he was shocked. Obviously, he'd heard another side of the story, and when I told him what was going down, he organised a meeting with one of the Matakana Islanders, a member of the mongrel mob, a chap by the name of Blue Kuka. And his sister, Taiwa Kuka, was one of the people that was involved in putting the log down on Matakana Island. You know, the road blockade that they'd put in place. And she was on the side of the Tiko Tukutuku directors, Graham Ingham, Dawn Shaw, Enoch Onatai, John Neal, Howard Palmer, the chairman of Ngātarangi Iwi. And when I explained to these mongrel mob guys at the back lawn, there I was standing there was a semicircle of them, all dressed with their full gang regalia. And Hop looked at me and he said, tell them your kōrero, Chris. And so I did. I spoke from the heart and I told them how I became involved in the bit of Matakana Island and you know, the history that sort of followed, and the reaction was at times incredibly angry, but not angry at me. They were angry because they realised that they had been fooled and that there was corruption going on in amongst Maori leadership. You know, I've had a number of wise people say to me, the Crown knows exactly what they did to you, Chris. And as far as handing over the ownership of Matakana Island to the tribal leadership, one only has to wonder, well, what exactly were the Crown investing in there? They're under a fiduciary obligation to protect wider Maori, yet they delivered the land into the personal names of the leadership. And of course, the Waitangi claim for the wider area of the Tauranga area, which involves, you know, I don't know how many acres, but a lot. Land worth billions and billions and billions of dollars. These same people who got the payoff through Tiko Tukutuku, of course, were involved in the settlement and organising committees to negotiate the settlement with the Crown. And of course they settled for dimes on the dollar, no doubt, because they could easily be tapped on the shoulder saying, look, we've enriched you personally, now do the right thing and let the Crown off a big bill. So in essence, the Crown stole from me to pay their debt. And it's that type of skullduggery, etc., that I've seen so often in amongst government. As a businessman, I used to see decisions out of politicians and different government agencies, whether it be local council or whatever. And I would shake my head in disbelief and I would ask myself, where the hell did they get permission to do that? How can they possibly make that decision? Where do they get that authority from? And of course, the fiduciary relationship is all about conferring power. You can have power to make your own decision about something, Go to a financial advisor or a doctor, and you can say that he can give advice as professional advice, and it's up to you to accept it. If you accept the advice, then you're conferring power to him to make a discretion on your behalf. And of course, the public own government. Government is a trust structure. The people own it. They confer power to politicians when they vote. But a fiduciary relationship comes with power being conferred on certain terms. And one thing is crystal clear, is that we don't confer power to them to be crooks, to use state assets, to manipulate, to lie to the public, or in my case, produce judgments that are completely fake. But what do you do when you take these people on? You can't do anything, can you? You look at our courts right throughout the country, they're littered with victims. I remember a lawyer was once asked, an American attorney, about did he ever worry about getting off a guilty party. And his reply was, they all get punished when they get my bill. And that's what the justice system's about. You'll get particularly solo fathers who are desperate to see their children. And they have to go through the courts. They have to go to a lawyer. And they have to spend tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they have to keep on going back because the compliance isn't complied with. And when you get an order from the court, you can't exactly pop down to the registrar and say, I never got the children last weekend, I was supposed to. They say, go and get your lawyer. And there are single fathers all over the place who are committing suicide as a result of this. The economic cost to our nations for red tape, which are lawyer-driven, for bad policy decisions by politicians, who in essence are on the take. Their political campaigns are funded by business, and business realised years ago in the 1960s that they really needed to not just support the right-wing parties, they also had to support the left. And of course you then saw the destruction of the unions so that the people wouldn't have a voice. And it's got to such a stage now whereabouts it doesn't matter if you vote for left or right. You get politicians who bullshit the public in the elections, they get in and then cause grief. New Zealand and Australia now owe in excess of $2 trillion. And that happened as a result of the Glass-Steagall Act, 1933 legislation, which was brought in to protect deposit holders in America. And Clinton in 1998, I think, repealed it. Massive donations by Wall Street, because what Wall Street wanted to do was to get their hands on trillions of dollars of deposits, bank deposits. And the legislation stopped them from doing that. So when they repealed it, they got their hands on it. And of course, they were then flying around in G4 Gulfstream jets all over the Commonwealth. And they were offering our traditional banks huge sums of money to put into the mortgage market. And that supply of money then drove up property prices, and the more the property prices went up, there was short-term gain that individuals who owned, say, a $100,000 house suddenly had a house worth $1 million. And they'd go out and they'd buy lots of things because of their newfound wealth. They'd buy more houses, adding to the Ponzi. But the net reality is that the wages have basically gone stagnant. You only need to look at it on a graph. I did one a few years ago, looking at it from 1990 through to, I think, 2015. And even when they do put out numbers, Department of Statistics, about wages, they're taking into account people who have, some of them are on $10 or $15 million or multi-million dollar salaries, or people in the mining industry up here in West Australia who are on $200,000 or $300,000 a year for operating a crane or something like that. not the school teachers and not the firemen and the ordinary people in the community, or people who are on welfare, people who are on pensions. Tiny increases to them, yet the net effect of everything around them is that prices are going through the roof. So people are hurting. I vowed that I would find a way to change the system. And so in talks with a number of businessmen over the years, very influential, very wealthy businessmen, but these guys are self-made, they're not corporates. They didn't go to university and do a degree and then think they know everything about fucking business. These are people who are self-starters, good people. And all of them, like me, are in the same position, whereabouts they were taking a look at what the hell is going on with these idiots in power. And over the years, I've kept in touch with them, given them progress, told them that the relationship between us and the politicians and the judges is clearly fiduciary, which involves you can't have a conflict of interest. A few years ago, Sky City in New Zealand, a casino, announced that they were getting, I think, around $100 million off the government to build a convention centre. And I wrote to them and the government and I said, you can't do that because you're using public funds to enrich a private casino, and the casino gave donations to you politicians. So that's a breach of fiduciary duty, and that's one of the things about fiduciary law. There can't be a conflict of interest. Same as when I went to Far Financial to borrow the money to buy Matakana Island. When I confer power to them for them to be able to cause me harm or do good for me, that's their decision that they make. Once they gain that power, I became vulnerable to the misuse of the confidential information, the business strategy. And you can't have that. You can't have a conflict of interest. And politicians can't have a conflict of interest. And so I decided, just of recent, that I would set up a foundation, a global foundation. I think we might call it the Fiduciary Law Foundation. But I needed the political arm of it, and so I came up with an idea called the Repair Party, and that we would run political campaigns throughout the world, and we would say to the people, look, stop. You know that you have been tricked by politicians, that the political system has been hijacked by business interests, and that we need to get in. You have to vote for the Repair Party, and they'll only be in a couple of months. So then you can have your normal politicians. If you really love and trust a particular politician, great. But first of all, vote for the Repair Party. Let them come in. Same as you put your car in for service or you're not feeling well, you go and see a doctor. You get these people in, our people. They will pass fiduciary legislation and then they will resign. And fiduciary legislation that will have teeth, that people can then take a cause of action directly against a politician. No more of these conflicts of interest. And wherever we can identify through the Fiduciary Foundation, where politicians have received donations, and then they have acted and given favour to those donors, then that's a breach of fiduciary duty, and we would go after it, and we would deem all contracts and advantages that the corporates got are illegal contracts, and that we would apply for a constructive trust order over the assets or gain that they got. In other words, re-enrich Parliament, make our governments rich again. Sure, we're taking it off the corporates, but the fuckers stole it. Those of you who have been around the block a few times like me, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The system is rotten. And we can't live like that, because if you take a look at what goes on with these wars, George Bush was a classic example with, suddenly what Bin Laden had hatched a plan to drive planes into buildings in America. You only need to take a look at the information. You can see You can see that there was a cover-up. The Saudis were involved, the Israelis were involved, and everybody of any influence in America who has attempted to get to the heart of it has been shut down. I was in Syria for quite some time, and I learned about the 1982 uprising as far as the West are concerned, with the propaganda we all get, was that here were these innocent people protesting and wanting democracy. Bullshit. There's nothing to do with that at all. But the protesters they did get out on the street, they then put snipers up on the roof, organised through the Muslim Brotherhood, funded by Saudi Arabia, instructed by Israel, and then they started shooting at the crowd. And then the West would turn around and say, you know, the Syrian army has shot innocent protesters. They did the same in recent years, claiming that that was happening in Aleppo and Dara and various other places. They shoot both sides. So when the police go out there just to keep an eye on the protests, then the shooting begins. The police don't know who's shooting at them, but they're getting shot. The protesters are getting shot. They think the police are shooting at them, but in fact it's, you know, proxy army people. You know, hired mercenaries, hired guns. Friends of mine in Aleppo told me about them getting up to the top of buildings and sitting there with sniper rifles shooting out the water tanks because there's not a water supply. It's just total destruction and all the rest of the people's soul and heart. Claims that they've been using chemical weapons is just bullshit. You know, where I had my little apartment in Damascus, just nearby, a few streets away, was where they claimed that rockets had launched a chemical attack. It's the same as Vietnam and what Daniel Ellsberg exposed. You look at what that young chap Snowden has exposed with what's going on in amongst the NSA and, of course, Julian Assange. You know, I encourage that. I encourage that intelligence papers would come to the surface and that the public should be able to have access at the skullduggery that's going on in amongst our systems of state. It's like, so what if there's a terrorist, a genuine terrorist who's actually planning something? What's the problem with that being exposed? The community can say, hey, look, what's the problem? What's going on? A lot of these religious individuals, some of the Muslim terrorists are genuine terrorists, you know, and they do say that they want a caliphate of some description. But as far as all that ISIS stuff and the Al-Qaeda stuff that's going on, I mean, take a look at the RAND report that was written in 2008. That was the total design of the theatre campaign between Sunni and Shia that everybody's been watching unfold. All done by proxy elements. You know, the massacre of millions of people. And of course, to make sure the journalists didn't go in there, they grabbed hold of a few and cut their heads off. See the quality of the video footage? And you read the RAND report, that's exactly what they were saying. Take a look at the fall of Mosul. 1,000 ISIS mercenaries go in there and take over, what is it, the 4th division of the Iraqi army. 30,000 men plus 30,000 police, about 100 Abrams tanks, hundreds of thousands of rifles and artillery and shells and munitions and everything. They went in there, 1,000 people took that over, and all the military was stood down. And so, well, where's the payment? Anybody watching this, go and do your own research. Take a look at the $850 million that Saudi Arabia deposited into Turkey shortly 2 weeks after the fall of Mosul, because the corrupt Iraqi officials who had delivered it needed payment. And that's the sort of nonsense that goes on. So Saddam Hussein's chemical attack on the Kurds, who supplied the chemicals? He was instructed to invade Iran. He was given the green light to invade Kuwait. The leadership in Kuwait, the Crown leadership, were given warning. They took off. All their money is in foreign accounts. Then the Americans turned around and said, well, it's going to cost you $500 million. $500 billion to get your wells back. That's why they didn't go after Saddam Hussein. I was in Washington, D.C. at the time when they were preparing for Desert Storm, and I had this sort of naive belief that, here's the Americans, they're going to go after the bad guys. The same thing, have faith. But faith doesn't often deliver the reality. And so after I had a meeting with a chap that was involved with Israeli intelligence, a bloke by the name of David Elberbaum. I saw David in Los Angeles at a security conference and again in New York, and then I went off down to Washington, D.C. He said, we'll catch up. When I got back up to New York, I got there, told him some conversations that I had down there with the State Department and other security officials. He set me straight. I got back to New Zealand and I said, they're not going to go after Saddam Hussein. They want to leave the instability in the area. And that's what they did. And this is the sort of thing that goes on all the time. Innocent people pay the price. And I ask myself lots of questions. But one particular question that I ask there is, whose benefit is all this? Don't us humans just want to sit down and relax? I certainly wanted to do that with my business interests. And yet for 18 years, I've had to fight this fight. I've had to suffer a whole range of things. But one thing that my mum taught me was that she taught me hope and determination. And she knew that I would think my way around this problem and find a solution. They tried to shut me up a number of times in a number of different ways. They even offered me the seat for Rotorua to get into Parliament. And Peter Tapser was horrified that I didn't take up that offer. But I didn't want to get in there and get caught up with compromise. Peter once told me that the way that the system works is that you get a tap on the shoulder one day and somebody will say, oh, look, there's some information about you doing this and, these other people have got this information, but, this is very, very serious and this is, the media gets hold of this is going to be the end of your career. But however, we've got some stuff against them and, we can sort that out, but this other issue, you're going to have to back off. I think the example he gave me was nuclear warships. That's the way it works. And that's the way that the system works. It works on compromise. I was told years ago from people involved in intelligence services that they love corrupt people in power. Because the great thing about corruption is you get certainty. If you've got somebody who's been fucking an underage, or if you've got somebody who's been involved in drug trafficking, or somebody who hasn't paid taxes, or somebody who's been involved in fraud, you're a perfect candidate for Parliament. Perfect. Because when they know that they can put the lean on you to make you follow the line, that's what they want. And this is our political system, and this is what I'm trying to modernise, and that's why I couldn't be with my mum. Because as much as I had a whole range of people, including ex-Special Forces guys who were prepared to look after me if I went to New Zealand to be with my mum, I wouldn't even get beyond the airport. I'd suddenly be arrested for contempt of court. They'd find a stick on me, what do they call it, a memory stick. not that I'd have one, but suddenly it would be, what's this child pornography? Anything to stop me. In 1997, after I won the main trial with Justice Paul Tem, I went to Seattle in the state of Washington, to have a talk to lawyers up there about taking on the two American partners in the Matakana transaction, ITT Ryanair and Port Blakely Tree Farms. And before I left, I checked my suit bag, and when I was going through it, I found a little round container that had heroin in it. I didn't have time to call the police, go down to the police. It was immediate. Flush it down the toilet, wash the container under the tap. Then I went out to the elevator and dropped it down the crack between the elevator and the door. Now, when I got to Auckland Airport, I got stopped and searched. And the customs guy, and it's on camera, it's on video, and again, whoever researches what I'm saying, take a look. But the customs guy says to me, "Where have you been?" I said, "America." "What did you go there for?" I said, "Business." And his reply straight away was, "Matakana Island business, was it?" And I looked him straight in the eye and I said, "Do you know Don Shaw?" And he blinked. It just caught him off guard that I had fired that one at him. He said, "Oh, that's got nothing to do with it." This is the way they work. I found a marijuana plant just down the back of the property here 3 weeks ago, and I got rid of it immediately. During the Matakana litigation, I had some marijuana plants that were around the side of my garage at Malulabar, 1517 Grandview Road. I had 3 compost bays, and here were these marijuana plants, and I found them. I just happened to go for a walk around the property, and I was looking at the decomposition of, the various states of sticks and mulch and leaves and all that type of thing in the compost bays, and there were these pot plants with marijuana plants in them. So I got rid of them immediately. I asked my gardener, Jeff Pont, if he knew anything about it. He didn't know anything about it. He hadn't seen them. Hadn't been there for quite a few days. But there they were, and the next morning the police turned up at my house with a search warrant. And they found a handgun in my jacket pocket, and they said it was loaded. In court they said he had a .303 rifle, near ammunition unsecured. The .303 rifle was an old World War I dug out of the dirt, no bolt, rusted barrel, impossible to fire, and the ammunition that was nearby was actually property of a private investigator working for, the ultimate payment of the account was a law firm in Auckland called Chief Anglin, partner David Abbott. And David Abbott had instructed 2 private investigators, Mark Van Leeuwarden and Wayne Kiley. And so they had got the services of 2 brothers. And I knew this from the beginning. And I had a private investigator by the name of John Hughes working for me. John was an ex-homicide detective. He had a lot of contacts. He was a very charismatic type of man. And I got a tax bill of, $1.4 million. And when we tracked that down, that was a guy, Tyler, in the tax department, who was a lawyer, who was a partner of Fanslow Tyler, company secretary of the merchant bank that I took on. One of the partners of the merchant bank was Sir Thomas Eichelbaum's son, John Eichelbaum, a barrister. Gary Judd, my barrister, never put up any fight against the Maoris down in Wellington when David Baragwanath QC was applying to lift my caveats to let the Maoris get hold of the land, and he never put up a fight. I had a hell of an argument with him at the James Cook Hotel. He was sitting there with one of my lawyers, Phil Ahern. He just spat rage at me and stormed off. And I was polite. I was saying I had a list of what David had been misleading the court on. I said, this document, that document, go and counter it. Wasn't interested. So I lost, and shortly thereafter, some time later, I went to visit Gary at his office in Anzac Avenue across the road from the High Court, next to the Holiday Inn. And you can see straight through the window, and who was sitting in Gary Judd's desk would David Abbott. David Barraguana, the soft cider. So I went into the reception and I said, and the reception looked a bit different. I said, where's Gary Judd? Oh, he's up in Mr. Barraguana's office. Mr. Barraguana's now a judge, and Mr. Judd has taken over all of his clients. And of course, the only client he didn't take over was Tiko Tukutuku and the Matakana Island Charitable Trust. And again, somebody doing research. What happened to the Charitable Trust? They were supposed to have 50% of the action, or 51%. Gone. All the interests and gain for that put into the private names of the people at the hierarchy of the tribe. Just weeks before my main trial against the bank, Gary Judd resigned. Said he couldn't act for me, that I'd lied on a security of costs affidavit. Conflict of interest. It was fine. I had plenty of other lawyers, including full-time lawyers. All the cross-examination, etc. was all in hand, all the evidence was in hand. We just needed the barrister, so we got Noel Ingram to carry the case, and we won. But the trouble with Noel Ingram was that he was charging us like a wounded bull, and we simply couldn't afford it. Now, I didn't know how bad things were with Gary Judd and the conflicts of interest, because these sort of things, it takes many years to piece it all together. And by the time I had pieced it together, I'd already been to the Court of Appeal with Gary Judd, lost, went to the Privy Council and lost, complained to everybody in the system and got nowhere. After I was in Australia for a while, I had my friend Sir Peter Tapsell, the former Speaker of Parliament, come over with Frank Brosnan. Frank Brosnan, Peter and I drove from India to London in '99 before the Privy Council. And within minutes of talking, I started mentioning Matakana Island, and Peter said, look, you're a clever entrepreneur. Go and find another deal, learn your lessons, and move on. Make another fortune. I thought about that. It didn't take me long for my reply. I said, all right, sure, I'm a clever entrepreneur. I can think up ideas on how to make money. But what have I learned? I've learned that I can't trust a bank. If I do come up with a good deal, the bank can steal it. They're allowed to. Barclay versus McLean showed that. That was me, the name of my case against the bank. McLean was the name of one of the directors. So I learned that you can't trust the bank, you can't trust your lawyers, you can't trust the judges, and then when you complain to the politicians, you can't trust the politicians. So what have I learnt? I've learnt the system's broken and needs fixing. That wasn't the answer Peter wanted. I met Peter through my mum when he first tried to get into politics. Back in the early 70s, I organised delivery of pamphlets all around Rotorua to help him get in. And we remained lifetime friends. I was his closest friend, and he was my closest friend. It was actually Mum who phoned me to tell me that Peter had passed away. I saw Frank before he died as well. He was a good man. But after he flew mosquitoes in World War II, he then had a career in government intelligence. He knew the system, he knew the way it worked. And he knew exactly what I was going after, as far as wanting to modernise democracy so that those who we trust managing our systems of state would be held accountable. I guess that's my mission. I look at the journey that I've been through, and you often reflect, why does something happen? Well, I realise that everything that I went through, the beatings from my father, and other things, have all shaped me. And And that's my life. So 2019, the petition goes into the Privy Council. We're finishing filming in January for some information material that will then go to influencers around the world. People like Matt Damon and George Clooney, all high-profile celebrities who don't like what's going on with government. And everybody points out the problem, but now they'll have a solution. Fiduciary legislation. And we can't get the existing politicians to bring it in because that would ruin their game, wouldn't it? So hence the Repair Party. And all the candidates can be just celebrities, sports people and so on, doesn't matter. Whoever wants to have a go at getting in Parliament, they can come along. Because you've only got one job in there, and that is to pass this fiduciary legislation. And some people have said to me, well, what about if you pass the legislation, then resign, and then the normal politicians take over? Won't they repeal the legislation? Well, the answer's they can try to, but anybody could go down to the local court and take out an application for an injunction blocking that on the basis that it's a self-interest action, which is a breach of fiduciary duty. So that's how we beat them. And I guess that's the price that all of the politicians and all the judges and all the skullduggerers I guess that's this is the result of what they did to me. You know, people looking from the outside, they see a strong person, they see a beautiful family, and things, they don't get to see the pain that we have suffered. And I'm not complaining about that. I don't think there's a member of my family who would be complaining about that. I've always been a believer that even if I was involved in a motor accident and I lost my leg, my optimism is that I'd probably meet somebody in the hospital and I'd figure out a deal. I don't know, invent a new type of lightweight titanium Kevlar device that would help people, go on another path of something that's interesting and, that's good. And Peter Tapsell always gave me good advice. Never look back with regret. Always look forward with optimism. Some things I look back, I have regret. I feel regret that my children never had the ability to spend more time with my mother. And now that she's gone, there's no turning that clock back. But my eldest girl she was nominated one of the best medical researchers in the world, even though she's in her final months of finishing off her PhD. She was headhunted by Dame Kay Davis from Oxford University. She's one of the best medical researchers in the world, and she looked at Catherine's work and she knew that this was the sort of girl that she wanted on her team.